Let me introduce our panelists. Mr. Gregory Kane is joining us for the first time this evening. We're delighted to have him with us. He's received an awful lot of attention for a lot of things, but including the article on slavery. I asked Mr. Kane how I should introduce him. He said there's nothing interesting to say. But of course, I find every one of his columns interesting. So I know that's not quite true. I did note, however, very quickly in looking at his resume that he graduated from City College, 7th in his class in 1969, a couple of years after Kurt Schmoke graduated as an outstanding quarterback for that school. Mr. Kane is one of a long line of Baltimoreans from City College who excels at what they do. Mark Matthews has been with the council at this program now for the past 5 or 6 years. Mark is the diplomatic correspondent of the Sun. Most of you know him. He's been with the Sun since 1980 and is with most good journalists, held a variety of fundamental jobs in their early training. But in the course of the first decade or so, did reporting jobs and editing on issues of crime, drugs, intelligence, the Iran-Contra affair, and the '88 campaign. Since 1990, as I say, he's been their diplomatic correspondent. Gilbert Lewthwaite is the defense correspondent for the Sun. Let me, I'm making these introductions a little longer because Fife would have wanted it that way. Mr. Lewthwaite has an interesting beginning to his resume. Born, educated, UK. As if that says it all. I didn't know whether that was a jibe at we Americans or not. But in any case, born and educated in the UK. He worked for the Daily Mail of London for 11 years, 1960 to 71. He was a national correspondent for half a dozen years, their Moscow correspondent for 3, Rome and Middle East correspondent from 69 to 71, before he joined the Baltimore Sun. And here, or at least in Washington, he's been the Washington correspondent, the Paris correspondent, the national correspondent, White House correspondent, Western Hemisphere correspondent, London correspondent, economics correspondent, and finally defense correspondent. And during that period of time, has had a series of very interesting coverages. He, while in London, was president of the Association of American Correspondents. He's been the member of the National Press Club since '72, and was chairman of the National Press Club's Board of Governors in 1996. And the chairman of our panel is Joe Sterne, who we usually introduce in one sentence because we feel as if we all know him. But let me say a little more this evening. Mr. Lewthwaite was born and educated in the UK. Mr. Sterne was born and educated in Philadelphia. His BA is from Lehigh University. His MA in journalism from Columbia School of Journalism. He was graduated with honors from both institutions, and he's a member of Phi Beta Kappa. He began his journalistic career, his newspaper career, with the Salt Lake Telegram. He worked with the Wall Street Journal and the Dallas Morning News before coming to the Sun, as I said, in 1953 as a staff reporter with the police courts and city hall and state government, and typical assignments of a beginning journalist. In 1957, he was posted to London, serving there for over 3 years. He was posted to the Washington Bureau, serving there from '60 to '69. During that time, he made 3 long assignments to Africa, covered the Goldwater campaign, '64, the Wallace campaign, '68, and the U.S. Senate beat, with special emphasis on civil rights and the Vietnam debates. In '69, Joe was posted to the Bonn Bureau, which included coverage of Eastern Europe, and then returned to Baltimore to become editor of the editorial page in 1972. Joe, in the interim, has served 3 times as a Pulitzer Prize juror. He's been a member of the American Society of Newspaper Editors and was influential in bringing their national convention here in 1993. And Columbia gave him one of their alumni awards for distinguished service to journalism in 1988. I take a little bit longer in introducing our guests than usual, simply to remind you of the length and distinction of these panelists. Their topic tonight is the Clinton foreign policy under the new team, which is a fascinating topic. As I say, this is the 5th time that they've made a presentation, the panel has, before the beginning of a new presidential term. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Joe Sterne and the Sun panel.
Thank you, Frank. In preparing for tonight's presentation, I kept thinking, what does 17 years mean? It does pass quickly, but I was thinking that 17 years would be a span of time comparable to the advent of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, all the way through the Second World War to the beginning of the Korean War. So we've been around for a long time, Frank. And when the Baltimore Sun panel made its debut before the Baltimore Council on World Affairs 17 years ago, Ronald Reagan had just been elected to the presidency. And all the world wondered what this would bring. Does it mean, I asked in my presentation, that President Reagan will spend all those extra billions on defense? Does it mean he really will be tougher on the Russians and nastier to third world countries that exhibit anti-American tendencies, and nicer to tin hat dictators on the right? Well, we all know some of the answers to those questions, subject, of course, to the revision of historians and the revision of historians. Reagan did spend those extra billions, and by doing so, he so enhanced U.S. superiority in the military sphere that he greased the skids for the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Without a doubt, that was a seminal event of the 17-year period I'm looking back on tonight. No one that I know back in those Cold War days really believed the Berlin Wall was going to come tumbling down in 9 years. And yet it happened. And I remember in our 1990 panel, when my friend and colleague Charlie Cordry triumphantly displayed a piece of the wall that he brought back from an assignment to Germany. Charlie died last spring, and we remember him as a great military reporter and a great panelist for the Baltimore Council on World Affairs, and we remember him with love and respect. Well, did President Reagan get nastier with third world countries tilting left? Indeed he did. While his greatest triumph came in the Cold War, he made it his business to thwart the Sandinistas who took power in Nicaragua. Overt and covert support for opponents of that regime resulted in the Iran-Contra scandal and gave us Ollie North. But to anti-communist crusaders, the game was worth the candle. The same goes for Reagan policy in El Salvador. In that case, as in Honduras and Guatemala, U.S. support for conservative governments, some headed by tin hat dictators, allowed them to survive into an era where ideological warfare diminished in Central America. Yet the end of the Cold War did not produce an America eager to involve itself in the world's troubles. Yes, there was a conflict with Iraq during George Bush's time, but Saddam Hussein was posing a threat to Western oil supplies. And in the opinion of many Americans, there was no choice there. And what developed during that war and in other minor conflicts was the doctrine of overwhelming force as a means of reducing American casualties to a minimum, and therefore preparing public opinion so that a few incursions are permitted from time to time, as we saw in Grenada and later in Haiti. Post-war Cold War policy was not really put to the test until the Bosnian War erupted. And the final story on that entanglement has yet to be written. Suffice to say, it is showing that NATO still may have a purpose in applying military power to trouble spots in or near the First World. The real challenge to America in the next 17 years and thereafter will be in the Third World. Let me cite some figures. In 1980, when this panel began, the world's population amounted to 4.4 billion people. Today it has risen to 5.8 billion. This is an increase of 1.4 billion human beings. It means that in the past 17 years, the equivalent of 5 U.S. populations have crowded onto the planet, virtually all in third world countries roiling with hunger, frustration, and chaos. Affluent nations can handle their affairs somewhat well, thanks to the largesse of technology. Poor countries cannot. It is the third world, and in particular, I would say the third world country just south of the Rio Grande and the Chinese colossus across the Pacific, that is likely to draw the attention of Sun panelists in the years ahead. I want to close by saying that my association with this organization has been one of the most gratifying opportunities I've had as an editorial page editor of the Sun. And Frank Bird, who has been the inspiration for all that this council has accomplished, knows very well that through these years I've been unable to serve as a board member because board membership is something newspaper men shouldn't do. So tonight, right out here in public, Frank, I volunteer my services to the council. We have a special treat tonight. The Sun made world headlines last year, and I'm not going to tread on my colleagues' turf to tell you about it. I'm going to let them do it. But I think everybody who reads the Baltimore Sun knows that we're going to talk about the Sudan and what 2 of our reporters did in bringing a very grievous situation to world attention. So I'm to start with Gil Lewthwaite. He and Greg Kane were the 2 reporters who covered this extraordinary story.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity, first of all, for appearing here again tonight. I thought what I'd do is walk you through what we did and why we did it, and then Greg Kane would talk a little about his part in the assignment. There had been reports of slavery in Sudan since about 1987 from the United Nations, from the State Department, and from various human rights organizations. They had been routinely denied by the government and attracted little attention in the media. And this intrigued the editor of The Sun, John Carroll, who's sitting over there. He thought if indeed there was slavery, there should be outrage about it, and it shouldn't be ignored. From the back? Towards it? Okay. Is that better? Okay. John Carroll decided that if indeed there was slavery, it should be exposed and it should cause outrage. And it occurred to him that the best way to do that would be to buy a slave. That would give us the ultimate proof of the existence of slavery. It would be hard to ignore, and impossible to deny. But the question was how to do it. And as soon as the idea occurred and we were meeting in the office, 3 questions were on the table. The first one was the danger. How dangerous would it be for us to go there and try and do it? The second was the feasibility. Could we actually do it? And the third was the ethics. Should we do it? We decided that the danger was manageable, that other reporters had been in and out of southern Sudan. Nobody had actually bought a slave, but people had been in and there had been some stories of slavery. We knew it was one of the remotest, most dangerous and disease-ridden places on earth. We knew we would have to go to the very front line of a civil war that had claimed 1 million lives and lasted for 13 years. But we also knew we couldn't go to the north of Sudan, where the government denied the existence of slavery and would prevent us from seeing it. The only route we could take in was into the south, into the southern rebel-held territory, where the slave raids were actually taking place and where we might get access to the trade. On the feasibility of it, I told John that I didn't think it was possible, that I thought we could go to southern Sudan, we could do a slavery story, we could interview ex-slaves, escaped slaves, we could interview families who had lost women and children. It's mainly women and children who are taken to slavery, but I didn't see how we could buy a slave. On the ethics of whether we should or should not do it, we were persuaded that we would serve a greater good by exposing it than the offense we might give by taking part in it, however minimally. We also found that in the abolition era, American newspapers had in fact bought slaves to tell their stories, so there was a journalistic precedent. And with the notion that sunshine is perhaps the best disinfectant, we decided that we would be justified in trying to shed light on this very dark corner of human existence. And as we made inquiries, we heard of a buyback system, a system whereby Arab middlemen would go from the south to the north where the slaves were being held and either buy them or abduct them and bring them back and sell them to their families. This persuaded me that there was a faint chance that we might be able to tap into that system and thereby buy the freedom of a slave. We were not interested, of course, in buying a slave to enslave them. The whole purpose of buying them would be to free them. So if we could tap into this system, we could perhaps do it. At the same time, I started to hear about a small group in Zurich called Christian Solidarity International. It was one of the very few groups, human rights groups or aid groups, that would go into the area we needed to reach, which was Bahr el-Ghazal, as I said, on the front line of the Civil War. Most of the major aid groups, the Red Cross, the United Nations human rights people, will not go into that area because it's banned by the government. It's a no-go area, and they will only go where they get government permission. But Christian Solidarity did occasionally go in. So I called Zurich and asked if they had any plans to go in anytime soon. They said they were going in, but the plane was loaded with other passengers and aid, and they couldn't fit us on. I, at this point, had never met Greg Kane. I work out of the Washington Bureau, and Greg is in Baltimore. So I arranged for Greg to come and have lunch at the press club and to discuss the story. Greg had been asked if he was prepared to go and said he would. I told him over the lunch that I thought we'd have maybe 2 or 3 months to prepare, since we couldn't go with the Christian Solidarity on the next flight. That was on a Tuesday. On a Thursday, Zurich called and said they could find room on the plane for Greg and myself if we could get there by Monday. So instead of having 3 or 4 months, we had 3 or 4 days to get ready. Greg at that point didn't even have a passport. He'd never been out of the country, and it was quite a tall order. We raced around, and Greg got a passport. We both became human pincushions as we were inoculated for Africa, and equipped ourselves for self-sufficiency in the wilderness. And we flew on a commercial flight from Baltimore to London, another flight London to Nairobi, and there we joined the CSI flight, a small Cessna, which took us from Nairobi to an aid station in northern Kenya called Lokichokio. We overnighted there, and then the next day we flew 500 miles illegally into Bahr el Ghazal. The plane dropped us on a dirt landing strip and immediately took off with some war wounded because it was too dangerous for it to stay on the ground any length of time. Greg and I were taken by local officials to a riverbank and invited to pitch our tents, which in fact proved to be quite a challenge, not being natural campers, but we did it. Our first question, of course, was whether there were any crocodiles. Happily there weren't, and all was well. But what we needed immediately was an interpreter. The local languages were either Arabic or Dinka, which was the local African tribe, and neither of us had a word of either. So Greg and I walked into the nearby village of thatched huts, basically, and started asking if anybody spoke English. It was a fairly frustrating operation for about 20 minutes until we came to a small group and asked the question, does anybody here speak English? And one man stepped forward and in perfect English said, I do, what can I do for you? So we embraced him and said, you can be our interpreter if you would, and happily he became that. And in the end we had 2 other interpreters, but he was the main one. The next day he took us around the village and we met families who had lost, the village had been raided a year earlier and had been virtually burnt to the ground. We met families who had lost their wives and children, daughters and sons in the slave raid. We also met several escaped slaves who had been taken and who had managed to escape. You must remember that a lot of the raids were basically done by Arab militia. They were not paid. They were run by the army, but were not paid. Their pay, in effect, was war booty, whatever they could take, whatever property, crops, or women or children, they were allowed to keep. And they were the basic source of the slave raids. The evidence of raids and human suffering was all around us. When we arrived, there were 2 Christian Solidarity officials on the plane with us. They had gone off during this day to meet tribal leaders while Greg and I were conducting these interviews. In the evening, after we had finished the interviews for the day, we were cooking our meals ready to eat, the military rations we had taken with us. Not cooking them, opening them to eat them cold, but we were preparing them anyway. And the 2 CSI officials came up and told us that they had heard from the tribal leaders that one of these Arab middlemen was in a nearby village about 12 miles away with a group of slaves he was selling back to their families. So Greg and I arranged to go there with our interpreter the next day. It was about a 3 or 4 hour walk in temperatures. I didn't have a thermometer, but it felt like about 120. And by the time we got there, Greg and I were just about finished. So we told the interpreter, who was loping along without any effort at all, that we needed to rest and collect our thoughts, and he showed us to the shade of a tree. And Greg and I collapsed in chairs made of sticks and goatskin and caught our breaths. And then suddenly from behind the tree stepped this Arab middleman. And we talked to him about what he did and why he did it. He explained to us that the reason that the buyback system existed was that the leaders of the Dinka African tribe, who were the victims of the slave raids, and the leaders of a local Arab tribe, the Rizigats, had reached an agreement whereby in return for the Arabs having grazing rights on Dinka land, they would facilitate the return of Dinka slaves, but there'd also be another price of 5 cows per slave, which is about $500. So after he had explained this to him, I said, well, we would in fact like to buy a slave. And he summoned a group of 12 boys whom I had not noticed, who were sitting in the distance under another shade tree. And they came forward, and they were a very abject, pathetic sight. Their bodies were covered in dust, they were dressed poorly. Most of their hair had the orange tinned roots, which is symptomatic of severe malnutrition. And they sat on the ground before us, and the slave trader invited us to choose our purchase. As we said in the articles, it was a moment for which neither education nor experience had prepared either of us. What we decided to do was to try and select the oldest boy, they were all boys, no girls, in the hope that he would be the most articulate and the most able to be a spokesperson for them all. And so we made the selection on that basis, and the boys stood up. Off to the side, under yet another tree, was a small group of parents, who turned out to be parents, who had come to the village to see if their children were among those being returned. So through the interpreter, we asked if any of them were the parents of the boy we had chosen. And a man stepped forward, and as he did, he tapped another boy on the head. This boy stood up and joined the boy we had selected. He turned out to be the half-brother of the boy we had selected. The polygamy is practiced by the Dinkas, and they had separate mothers but the same father. So we ended up buying 2 slaves. And then we sat down and talked to them about their lives. They had been taken 6 years earlier. The 2 boys we freed were aged 10 and 12. It's not unusual for the Arabs to take very young children in these raids. And it's not unusual, of course, in the African bush for very young children anyway, but to be put to work by their families at a very young age. So these boys had been taken. They had both been given Muslim Islamic names, and they had been put to work in a cattle camp, cleaning the fences and cleaning up the dung. It was a very difficult conversation. They were not forthcoming in any way. They were very quiet, very passive. The father was far more excitable and excited. And in the end, it was clear, after what appeared to me anyway to be an excruciating length of time, that we'd got as much as we could out of these 2 boys, of how they had lived and how they had been treated. And so we thanked them and said farewell to them. They had given us basically the evidence that we had been looking for, the experience we had tried to achieve, and we had given them at least their freedom. And so we parted from them, and they went into the bush, and hopefully are now safe there. But of course the raids are still going on, and there is every possibility that they could be retaken. With that, I will let Greg step in and describe his involvement.
Well, first of all, good evening to everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I'm not speaking from a prepared text. I'm not a very good public speaker. I'm as equally dreadful with prepared text as I am speaking off the cuff. So there's no reason to work on a prepared text when it's inevitably going to be bad anyway. So I'm just going to wing it, because I assure you this will be bad. And I'm not going to speak long. I mean, if any of you have read my column, you know the respect I have for Calvin Coolidge and why I respect him. It's because he didn't talk much, didn't talk long. Probably was as bad a public speaker as I am, I suspect. So I'm not going to be long. I just want to touch on a few points. I think the most interesting things about the Sudan trip actually happened when we got back. I mean, we talked to the Sudanese ambassador, who came up with a all sorts of reasons and justification. Well, when we first met him at a hotel in Washington. His story then was he urged Gil and I to go to Khartoum and report what we found to the government, because the government was categorically against slavery. It was illegal in Sudan. And once we gave this report, they would investigate and they would punish the guilty parties. That was his first, and he even offered to get us visas and said we could go. And it was decided later on that we wouldn't go. And we've been criticized for that. We've been criticized by my good friend Louis Farrakhan and his Nation of Islam. We've been criticized by Lyndon LaRouche's people, and that's a guy I have a lot of respect for, Lyndon LaRouche. And we've been criticized by, apparently there was a group of black state legislators who went to the Sudan after we did, and came away with this glowing report that there is indeed no slavery in the Sudan. And Gil and I met some of these characters at the Carnegie Institute for Peace back in November. And where they visited was the Nuba Mountains in an area that is controlled by the government, and Khartoum. And that was it. And then they come away saying that, A, there is no slavery in the Sudan. And then they accused Gil and me of actually trying to destabilize the government of Sudan by reporting the story we reported. So I'm sitting there wondering, these are black state legislators, and I wonder who these guys ran against to get elected. Because I know dead people with more cognitive ability than these guys show. One even said that because it wasn't institutional, that slavery wasn't institutionalized in Sudan, hence it was not slavery. And I think, well, slavery is slavery. What's it got to do with but these are black elected officials. It changed my opinion totally on, black districts, predominantly black districts. That's all, because you got to wonder how some of these characters got elected, but that's what they claim. They visited Khartoum, Nuba Mountains, under government control, come away saying no slavery. Don't visit Bahr el Ghazal, where Gil and I were, where the slave raids take place, and it would be easy to find folks who are either relatives of people who abducted or who had been abducted and escaped. It's like doing a report on poverty in the United States and going to Beverly Hills and nowhere else. Not going to Murphy Homes or Lexington Terrace or any of those places, just doing a story on poverty in the United States, going to Beverly Hills where only the rich folks are, then coming away saying there's no poverty in the United States. I mean, it's that kind of analogy. So that's the kind of thing we have to deal with. But the reason we didn't go to Northern Sudan, we could have, and still might, at least I might, I'll get to more on that later, but we could have. But it occurred to Gil and I, we talked to the ambassador on a Thursday, I think Gil and I talked again that Monday in the office. And Gil said, we did enter the country illegally. I said, yeah. He said, what's to stop them from arresting us when we get to Khartoum? I said, absolutely nothing. There's nothing to stop them from arresting us once we got to Khartoum. I get the feeling that had we gone to Khartoum when the ambassador wanted, you wouldn't have seen the Sudan series. You'd have seen stories about 2 American reporters in jail in Khartoum. You'd have seen that to this day, because that's where we would have been. That's what I believe. Because the first reports of slavery in Sudan back in '87, it didn't come from Westerners, didn't come from human rights organizations. It came from 2 northern Sudanese Muslims who investigated the problem and reported it to the government. They got arrested. They ended up in jail for telling the government something they didn't particularly want to hear. So Gil and I thought, well, they got more grounds to lock us up because we actually did something illegal. We entered the country illegally. So there was nothing to stop them from locking us up once we got to Khartoum. In addition, I mean, to accurately report the story, we shouldn't just go to northern Sudan. We would have to go to parts of Egypt. Once I got back, I got a call from a guy in Egypt, Christian, southern part of Egypt, who said that the Islamic government of Sudan has caused problems for Christians even in that area of Egypt. And there was a fellow from Uganda at the NABJ convention back in August. He said there have been government raids by northern Sudanese into refugee camps in Uganda where southern Sudanese have camped out. So you would have to go to Egypt, you have to go to Uganda, where the refugees are, probably Kenya, where there are more refugee camps, and Eritrea. You have to go to all those places if you want to get the story. So it's not just a case of going to northern Sudan to get a better story. We would have to visit places such that we'd still be out there visiting those places. So we had to cut the line off somewhere. But to visit all the places we'd have to visit to get a full story, we ended up doing a book and not just a 3-part newspaper series. So there's all kinds of reasons why we had to stop where we stopped. I'll say this and then I'll conclude. The thing that impressed me most, or one of the things that impressed me most, And this relates to how Clinton is going to conduct his foreign policy toward Africa and elsewhere in the future, assuming he has the backbone to do it, because I've said before, I don't think Clinton has much backbone, but he's going to have to in this particular case. Gil and I both talked to a fellow named Yusuf Maki. He's from the Nuba Mountains. He's a Muslim, but he's fighting on the rebel side. He says he's fighting specifically against a government he feels is Islamic fundamentalist. He's fighting for a democratic and secular Sudan, and he cannot abide a government that is Islamic and fundamentalist. And we asked him why. He said because these people believe they have a message to give to the world from God and that only they can give it. He said that they believe they're destined to take over the world and that the time is ripe for them now with the fall of communism. So that is probably the next major challenge now that communism has fallen for American presidents to face, Islamic fundamentalism. You've got them now in, I think, Iran and Sudan. You better pray that they don't spread, because then you'll be facing a major problem. If there is a third world war, I believe it will be because Islamic fundamentalism has taken hold in countries throughout North Africa and the Middle East. That will be where your third world war comes from. And we're going to need a president, frankly, with the backbone to face that. And frankly, I don't know if we have one. I'm not sure at all. They're going to do things, and some of it's going to be a bluff. Clinton's going to have to call the bluff. I don't know if he's got the backbone to do that. But I believe that is where your next major world war will come, if it comes. It will come from countries that under the clutches of Islamic fundamentalism, which is another name for fanaticism. Because when we were at the Carnegie Institute, there was a Southern Sudanese who said that the real force behind the Sudanese government is a fellow named Hassan Tarabi, who he quoted as saying that the Islamization of Africa was really interrupted by European colonialism. And now that the colonialism has ended, it can continue apace. So his goal, at least, I don't know about other Muslims, but his goal is for the Islamization of the entire continent under an Islamic fundamentalist regime, if he can. So you can think of what a problem that would pose if he's successful. That's why Yusuf Maki is fighting against him. He certainly doesn't want that to happen. I don't think we want it to happen either. I'm sure there's millions of Muslims throughout the world that don't want it to happen. Millions of moderate Muslims who are against Islamic fundamentalism. So that's where the next major foreign policy crisis is going to come. Thank you very much.
We'll now return to our usual format. Mark Matthews is going to tell us how Madeleine Albright is going to run U.S. foreign policy. And after that, Gil Lewthwaite will tell us how Bill Cohen is going to run the Pentagon. Okay, Mark.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all very much for coming this evening, and thank you for having us. I spent part of yesterday covering the Madeleine Albright confirmation hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was a love fest. Even the crusty, irascible Jesse Helms bent over backwards to be courteous and gracious towards Mrs. Albright, and it all seemed to signal something of a new era. So, to those of us who have been following the diplomatic beat, it's been rather sleepy in recent years and months. It was a bit like a breath of fresh air. People were lined up down the hall to take their places in the audience. The New York Times had 2 reporters and a columnist there. The Wall Street Journal had 2 reporters. This morning when I plugged in Albright's name in our computer system, 24 wire stories popped back. To say that she is a good communicator and her predecessor, Warren Christopher, wasn't, doesn't quite give the whole story. She's got star quality and she's a good politician. Star quality can take you quite a long way in foreign policy because you've got any Secretary of State has a bully pulpit that is second only to that of the White House. They've got a world stage and a worldwide audience, and this audience is often made up of people who can be moved by eloquent use of language and skillful delivery, both of which Madeleine Albright has. And as a lifelong teacher, she knows the power of the word. Also, because of her family background, her father was a Czech diplomat, and the family fled her country first from the Nazis, and then again after Stalin took over Eastern Europe. She knows about tyranny, and she seems to have an instinct for recognizing evil when she sees it. As Jean Albright said on Mrs. Albright's appointment, she knows the world. And this has caused her to reflexively oppose and argue for forceful action against the Serb aggression in Bosnia, and it also caused her to strongly oppose the Somali warlords and to try to stay the course there against more moderate voices within the Clinton administration and in the international community. On the first issue, Bosnia, she ended up prevailing in internal arguments, but only after about 2 years of failure, and only when a Bosnia disaster loomed like a dark cloud over the Clinton re-election campaign. In the second instance, she lost. The United States, after the debacle involving the deaths of Marines in Somalia, slowly withdrew its troops and left the region pretty much with its tail between its legs. At that point, Madeleine Albright kind of disappeared from the scene. Even though she had a high-profile job at the UN, we didn't see her very much on TV, and she stopped using her then favorite expression, which was assertive multilateralism, the doctrine that she pressed of enlisting other countries in tough action that the United States didn't have a strong enough interest in to conduct on its own. That signaled something of a change in both the way she conducted herself in office and in the American attitude towards the United Nations. She became a strong critic of the United Nations and got out front of the Republicans in Congress in pressing for reform. And in the past year, she also led the fight against the Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, who earlier in their tenure had been considered her friend. She managed very adroitly, I think, to organize the fight against Boutros Ghali, maneuvering the African countries, which were solidly behind him, into a position where they could either continue to support him or lose their chance to have an African as Secretary General. And she totally outmaneuvered France, which had outmaneuvered the United States 5 years earlier. And as a result, France ended up being the only member of the Security Council to vote for Boutros Ghali in the end, and he was quite smoothly and easily replaced by somebody the United States had favored all along, Kofi Annan. With that as something of a trophy, Madeleine Albright returned to Washington and to accolades and was appointed as Secretary of State and will be the first woman to hold that job, and in fact the highest ranking woman to serve in the United States government. She is an unlikely trailblazer, having been a college professor for many years and having not had a really high-profile job until going to work at the United Nations. But this has increased the amount of support that she has around town and made her very much a force to reckon with in Washington and worldwide. Whether she will use it to put her stamp on foreign policy and in fact to put an American stamp on world affairs is really in question. She said during her confirmation hearings, this is one of her memorable sound bites, that the United States has to be the author of world history now, and not just a participant in it. But she's still working for the same president who hired her 4 years ago, and this is the president who hesitated on Bosnia, hesitated for a long time on Haiti, hesitated, as we also saw, on Somalia, and has flip-flopped on China and kind of wavered on Russia and delayed on decisions on on expansion of NATO. I have a feeling that Madeleine Albright is going to be assigned the task of selling in public the decisions that are reached by a group, including herself, but a group that she will not dominate in private. And there will be more cautious voices whispering in the president's ear. One of them will be that of Samuel Berger, the new national security advisor, who is one of those behind-the-scenes figures in Washington who wield great influence but don't seem to have much in the way of an ego. And as a result, they earn presidents' trust by not developing their own public persona and not trying to steal the limelight. I also think that another influential voice, an increasingly influential voice in foreign policy, will be Vice President Albert Gore, who will want to demonstrate his foreign policy credentials well in advance of the presidential campaign in the year 2000. On Mrs. Albright's plate and that of the administration, the first priority that she pointed to yesterday, and perhaps the most difficult one that she's going to face with the Hill, is money. Over the past couple of years, the Clinton administration has lost a series of fights with Congress over money. First over paying arrears to the United Nations, next over funding the whole foreign policy operation, ranging from the heat in foreign embassies. There's one where the heating system has collapsed and they haven't been able to turn it back on, or it was out for a long period of time. Mrs. Albright mentioned yesterday that there was a U.S. ambassador to Moldova who, for a while, was having to wash dishes in the sink. The equipment inside the State Department is very, very outdated, and there have been complaints about the phone system, complaints about computers. There was, for a long time, a kind of standoff between Jesse Helms and others on the Hill and Warren Christopher. They wanted him to eliminate agencies and reorganize the bureaucracy and fold everything into the State Department. He refused, and they refused in turn to increase his budget. And they're now paying the price for that. Morale is very low in the United States Foreign Service, and they are closing missions and having a difficult time recruiting the same caliber of diplomat that the world had come to expect. Out beyond our borders, confronting Mrs. Albright, the immediate problem she is going to face, and the one that she's perhaps least equipped to deal with because of her own academic background and lack of experiences in this area, is the Middle East. Warren Christopher spent an enormous amount of time trying to coax the players in the Middle East to advance the peace process, and he had only partial success. It is an undertaking that seems to claim and chew up secretaries of state and requires a lot of patience and a lot of skill and a high level of frustration, and it will be interesting to see if Mrs. Albright has the patience and the fortitude to deal with it. Right now, the negotiations over Hebron, the second largest city in the West Bank, are teetering between collapse and success. Success will mean that the Oslo process that was inaugurated on the White House lawn in 1993 will move forward with the logic that will ultimately lead, many people think, to a kind of demilitarized Palestinian state, although it may not be called a Palestinian state, and some kind of symbolic recognition of East Jerusalem as a center of Palestinian affairs, if it's not called the capital. If it collapses, the most immediate outcome is likely to be more violence. It takes less of a provocation than this for the West Bank to erupt in violence, as we've seen repeatedly in recent years, and the entire relationship, the entire progress that's been made in Israeli-Arab relations would likely be set back. Already, the Egyptians are starting to sour on their peace with Israel. The Jordanians are getting nervous, and President Assad of Syria is sitting in Damascus watching the whole thing, and I imagine he's gloating. I'm just going to touch on two other areas because we're running out of time here. One is Russia. Boris Yeltsin is now back in the hospital with pneumonia, having just recently had heart surgery, throwing into question the whole stability of the Russian leadership and opening up the question once again of succession, just a few months after we thought that problem had been settled. One of Madeleine Albright's priorities is going to be the smooth expansion of NATO. When it comes to Russia, I think she is going to be trusted less than Warren Christopher was, and perhaps less than Bill Clinton is, simply because of her Eastern European background, her strong support for the yearnings of Eastern Europeans to join the West, and her friendship with President Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia. A final area that is going to really test her, and this opens up a discussion of a new recent problem in Clinton's foreign policy, is China. The the United States has allowed human rights to take a back seat in its dealings with China. Emphasized now are trade, military-to-military cooperation, and the difficulties in dealing with China on the subject of Taiwan, and keeping a close watch on how China reabsorbs Hong Kong. This relationship is fraught with all kinds of dangers and complications, and the Clinton administration, through the Democratic fundraising apparatus, has just added a major new danger to it, which is the appearance that Asian businessmen with strong interests in investment in China seem to be getting through the back door a way into the White House and a way to talk policy with the president and perhaps influence him. There's no evidence yet that they have actually caused any specific changes in policy. It just happens that the policy that they advocate is also the policy towards China that President Clinton has adopted and is pursuing, namely a strong emphasis on trade and investment. We've seen powerful ethnic lobbies in the past, the Israel lobby, the lobby in support of Greece, the lobby for Taiwan, but there's something a little bit different about this and a little bit more worrisome because we don't really know what Lippo, what James Riotti, one of the heads of Lippo, and the other Asian businessmen who have been getting into the White House, we don't really know what they're after or what ties they may or may not have with governments in Asia. And with that on the horizon, I'm going to end it.
And we'll have to bring this session to an end. And I do want to, after we thank the panel, to say something, thank Joe. But let me first of all thank all the four members of the panel for another most enjoyable evening. Your overview of what stands in front of us in foreign policy was, I think, very interesting. And I think thanks for sharing the very courageous Sudan enterprise with us as well. So for the 17th time, we thank the panelists and the Baltimore Sun very much.